You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome. I'm Esther Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining us today. On today's show, we'll discuss tax in Nigeria's digital economy. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther Awoniyi. Now, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, says digital economy is increasingly becoming the economy itself and will not be feasible to ring-fence it from the rest of the economy for tax purposes. Now, the OECD is therefore proposing a consensus solution to the tax challenges. Now, can Nigeria benefit from this? Jeremy Cape, an international tax partner at Squire Patton Boggs, joins me now for this discussion. Jeremy, thank you for joining me today.
Lovely to be here, Esther.
So the OECD is trying to come up with a robust consensus, to develop a consensus solution to the tax challenges that have arisen from digitization. But I want to start by asking you, how long have we been have these discussions, these conversations been on about how it has become necessary to review the rules as to how a company, foreign company, is taxed in outside jurisdictions in the first place?
Yes, that's a very good question. How long has this been going on? It's probably been the case that sort of 30, 40 years ago, tax was seen as something that it was entirely legitimate to try and avoid through whatever means were legal. Okay, so if you could put into place largely artificial arrangements, routing money through different jurisdictions with whom a business had no connection otherwise, then it was absolutely fine to do that. We've seen perhaps in the last decade, maybe slightly more than that, attitudes changing towards tax avoidance and the way in which the international tax system works. And it was earlier this decade when politicians started to look at the way in which businesses were arranging their affairs and saying, this isn't really getting us to the right result. And I think there was also a sense, looking at developing countries, that they were not getting a fair share of the tax that was due to them. For example, many African countries didn't until very recent years have transfer pricing rules that enabled, that would put some restriction on the ability of intragroup transactions to be treated as if they had been made at market value. The things really started to move in earnest, though, around 2013, 2014, with the origins of the BEPS project, which stood for Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, which was carried out by the OECD at the request of the G20 to look at the international tax system and to consider what changes could be made in order to make it work better than it currently did.
Okay. So now the question is, the way now digitization is allowing companies to conduct, significant business operations across borders without necessarily interacting with individuals or having a permanent establishment, which the tax treaties are fundamentally based on. But now, according to the OECD, what we're hearing, that has to change, because now the countries are losing, like you just mentioned, developing countries. I mean, a country like Nigeria is obviously losing out on taxing or income from the digital economy. So what is the OECD proposing now?
Yes, I think it's important, before going on to that, to just take a step back to where the BEPS project left digital. The OECD essentially parked digital. It was action point 1 in the report, and the OECD said, well, is it correct to look at digital and at taxing digital when really the whole economy is moving towards digitalisation? So they were drawing a distinction between digital and digitalisation and saying that you can't really look at a particular business and say that it is digital or it is non-digital. I mean, there are the clear examples of the internet-based companies that are digital, but even more conventional businesses are becoming digitalised. For example, travelling by taxi. 10 years ago, if I was in Nigeria then, I would be hailing a cab, paying with cash. Nothing would touch digital. Now, I came to the studio today using a popular ride-sharing app. It works absolutely perfectly. So things are evolving in that way. So the OECD, I think, rightly looked back in BEPS and saying, if we try and tax digital, we're not going to be doing the right thing. We're going to be looking at taxing the digitalised economy. And as a result of that now, the proposals they're coming up with go a lot further than taxing, frankly, the digitalised economy, both of those things. They go now to looking at the way in which tax works internationally. And in doing that, they're actually taking on board some of the criticisms that have been made and were largely dismissed about the way in which profits are shared across countries in which businesses operate.
Okay, so I mean, back to my question now. Okay, so for the proposals, I'm just wondering, what would be the key themes of these proposals? If they're saying that companies may eventually, companies may eventually become digitized, as it were, then I mean, let's not make those separations, such as maybe one sweeping tax rule or sweeping tax treaties or tax rules. I mean, how's this going to work?
Yes, I mean, because the way business is evolving now is the OECD is saying whether you are a digitalized business or not, and most businesses are tending towards using digitalisation more than they were. The current rules for allocating profits within the global jurisdictions in which a business operates are not working. And also because digitalisation doesn't require permanent establishments, some sort of permanent taxable presence, maybe we need to look at that. Because historically, the case has been that, and it is in Nigeria, that essentially in order to be able to tax a business, you need to find a permanent establishment. Now, there's a lot of case law, there's a lot of academic writing that keeps me very busy on what is meant by a permanent establishment. How permanent does that have to be? Could my hotel room that I'm staying in Lagos, could that be a permanent establishment for tax purposes? But they're trying to move beyond that and saying, well, maybe there can be a connection with a jurisdiction, a nexus with that jurisdiction, which isn't a physical establishment, but is sufficiently influential in relation to its impact on that economy that it should be treated as such. When you then have that virtual establishment, let's call it, there's then a question about how the profits get allocated. Now, historically, that's been done through transfer pricing, which I alluded to at the beginning, through the transfer pricing rules, but those have historically focused on the so-called arm's length standard. And what that is asking is saying, well, if we've got company A in this jurisdiction, we've got company B in this other jurisdiction, they're related and they have a transaction between them, we will impute on that transaction the terms, including the price, not limited to the price, that would have been entered into between unrelated parties acting at arm's length. The issue is that quite often you can't find one of those transactions because that's the way in which global business organises itself. But the EU
did something or is doing something similar too. I mean, we talked earlier about, okay, maybe not even what India has done. India has found a way around it, but the EU, I mean, what you just said, I mean, is similar to, in terms of the value of the transactions and, where income was earned, etc. I'm just thinking, well, that's already a sort of working model, isn't it?
Well, these things are still in their infancy. I mean, there does seem to be a gradual realisation that the way in which profits are being allocated on the arm's length basis isn't appropriate, and it's taken a long time for the OECD, which is very much wedded to that principle, to move. You make a point though. One thing the OECD is absolutely concerned about is to make sure that the tax reform internationally proceeds on a consensus basis. They don't want to have individual countries or blocks introduce their own rules. And you alluded to the EU, India has done it, and it's working for India. But I mean, I'm just thinking, if the new solutions, if there's the OECD is able to arrive at a consensus solution or suggestions, what happens to countries like India who have gone on and put in a separate model of their own? Right. And of course, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, the hope is, and I suspect this is right because the OECD and this project being led by Pascal Saint-Amans, Grace Perez Navarro, both extremely competent, charismatic people who can really drive that change. I suspect what would happen is that India and the UK, the EU, would align with the OECD, but there is clearly going to be some battle there. And one problem, of course, when you try and do this, is that at the start, every country thinks that it's going to be a winner. So you look at Nigeria, we'll say, well, look, in relation to non-digitalised business, digitalised business, there's a sense that Nigeria isn't getting its fair share of tax revenues. You look at the tax to GDP ratio in Nigeria is about 6% or
yes.
so, compared to an OECD average of about 35%, Norway's up at 55%. Now, you can find a country that as a matter of policy, wants to have a low tax to GDP ratio. And again, that's going to be an issue that's going to come up, because it's maybe the OECD's taking us to a position where they're saying you can't do that.
Yeah.
But Nigeria doesn't really want to be at 6%.
Obviously, and to tell you, because right now there are actually conversations going on in Nigeria about, although right now the focus is on digitizing the tax collection process, there isn't much of a focus on how to get the earnings, income from digital transactions. But the Federal Inland Revenue Service, as I was telling you earlier, has taken one step, first of all, to impose VAT, value-added tax, on online transactions. And we know that that is a start. And now experts within the industry are calling for the government to come put together a framework that would help it to better get income from digital transactions. So Nigeria may be on its own end coming up with a framework and developing that structure. At the same time, we have the OECD trying to put that one. So that's back to that initial earlier question. How do we reconcile and ensure that it's fair play? Foreign companies operating in a place like Nigeria don't find themselves in the situation where they have to go to court over how their incomes are taxed. Right. No,
a couple of points.
It just sounds like a very complicated.
Yeah. Well,
so many moving.
Welcome
parts
to my world. One thing to say on the VAT side of things. Firstly, Nigeria's rate of VAT is too low. 5% is far too low. Okay, starting point. Secondly, having a VAT on digitalised services is not inconsistent with this proposal.
Okay.
Again, in the EU, there was a move a number of years ago to tax non-residents on electronically supplied services made within a jurisdiction. And we're seeing now more efficient enforcement mechanisms. Again, going back to where things were 20, 30 years ago, tax debts were generally not enforced cross-border. If there was a tax charge in one jurisdiction, but no assets in that jurisdiction against which a local revenue authority could go.
Well, Jeremy, we're going to take a short break at this point. We'll come back and pick up from where we left off. Thank you for your time so far. I've been speaking to Jeremy Cape. He's an international tax partner at Squire Patton Boggs. If you're just joining us, Jeremy Cape, an international tax partner at Squire Patton Boggs, is with me today, and we're discussing tax in Nigeria's digital economy. Thank you, Jeremy, for your time so far. We've talked a lot about, what this proposal could look like and all the factors that are going to be taken into consideration. But another question is, will it see the light of day? Because it just sounds so complicated, so many moving parts, and I'm just thinking, get everyone on board and ensuring to a large degree that it ends up being a win-win situation for everybody?
Yeah, well, that's the problem, that it can't always be a win-win situation. And it can't always be win-win for countries, and it can't always be win-win for businesses. There's a very ambitious timetable in relation to this project. They want to have a final report next year. And that requires, frankly, near unanimity among countries across the world. Now, there will be some who will win, and there will be some who will lose. There will be some who win a lot. There will be some who lose a lot. If you're coming up with general proposals, it is quite possible that some types of business will be taxed in a way that it makes it prohibitive for them to carry on with business. One area that isn't really looked at, which is important for Nigeria and other countries across the world, different ones, but a lot of African countries, relates to the taxation of natural resources. which many think doesn't work properly at the moment in terms of the way in which the revenues are shared between the source country, i.e. where the oil is or where the copper is, and the country of the residence of the miner. Now, it's suggested, I think, in this report that natural resources will have to be taxed differently because it's very different from looking at a consumer-focused business, or let's say, a TV station, pan-continental TV station, or a law firm like Squire Patton Boggs, which is global, which is involved in projects all across 54 African countries. So, do you then park natural resource taxation out of this? So we're just not going to try and change the way in which that's taxed. Does that then lead it to be left behind? And whilst Nigeria clearly has to look beyond natural resources, particularly oil and gas, in terms of its revenues, that's still a very important part of things. So I think there's a potential danger in this proposal that Africa could get left behind. And that's why it's so important for the Nigerian government, for FIRS, for the regional groupings, for Africa as a whole, to make sure that it engages with the OECD, who are very...
are they engaging at the moment?
Well, they are and they aren't. I mean, the issue is that it is the OECD. It's not the UN. So the OECD represents the OECD countries. So I've certainly, in relation to the BEPS project, I heard numerous thought leaders in African taxation, and I always defer to them. It's not for me really to conclude it one way or the other, but a number felt that there was not sufficient engagement with the concerns.
Yes, because there could be a
Africa.
pushback. I mean, is the OECD also thinking about that possibility, opening up a door for a pushback from resource countries, dependent countries like Nigeria?
Yes, I don't know. I mean, they've got a lot of their work cut out at the moment. But yes, I think that has to be a clear risk. Now, it is possible that, I mean, on the face of it, you would have thought that most African countries should benefit from an approach to profit allocation that enables more of the market jurisdiction to be able to tax. Okay, to give my examples earlier on social media, etc., you would have thought that given that Nigeria gets, I would imagine, pretty much close to zero revenues from the internet-based companies, then something that then says that there is sufficient taxable nexus in Nigeria and the user base is creating the value, therefore we're going to tax the user base, that should give rise to more tax revenues. But there's also then the question of how on earth companies are going to work this out, and how on earth revenue authorities, which frankly most of Africa are completely underfunded, are overwhelmed. The moment that you have a really talented young person who's coming through, they will get offered more money to go and work for a Big Four accounting firm. So then the question is, in terms of resourcing these changes that should in theory raise more revenue locally, can that be done in a way that is cost efficient?
Now, I want to take you back. I want to quickly take you back to that statement you made about some might win more than others, some might get more benefits. In what instance would a company, an entity have more advantage or be in a better position to benefit more than another?
Yeah, I mean, let me give you let me use an example of CNBC Africa. So you've got headquarters in South Africa, there are bureaus in Lagos and a number of other African countries, but by no means all. You have viewers across the whole of Africa. And you also have viewers who will be watching this, probably mainly my friends and family, but will be watching this in the UK, in the US, in the EU. Let's suppose at the moment most of the profits will arise in one particular country, probably the source country, probably South Africa, where a TV station doesn't have any physical presence, so let's say Equatorial Guinea, then there isn't going to be much tax arising in that jurisdiction. But if let's take, it's the same principles. This is why it's digitalization, not just digital. So if I'm in a hotel in Equatorial Guinea and I am watching either on my computer or I'm watching on the TV, and let's say I'm watching it on the computer, so the little advertisement comes up. I'm consuming that advertisement in Equatorial Guinea. Should Equatorial Guinea be able to tax some of that value that I'm creating? If the answer is yes, then essentially there are two outcomes. Either South Africa will get less because CNBC Africa is paying more in Equatorial Guinea, or South Africa doesn't get less and CNBC Africa ends up paying more tax overall. So these are the issues that are going to arise, and that's before you even get to the question of how on earth do the Equatorial Guinea revenue authorities look at these arrangements and decide how to allocate. And how does a formula that has to apply, let's say we take natural resources out of it, but it's a formula that in theory has to apply to social media, but also to law firms, etc. How do we then apply that formula in that particular instance? Getting from there to some laws that are universal across jurisdictions that have different tax laws seems to me to be quite an ask. But again, if anyone can do it, the current OECD crowd should be able to.
Should be able to, because I was going to ask you that is there an appreciation on the part of the OECD how complex this is and the potential pushback that could ensue, and also maybe some parts of it being subject to different interpretations, by different law, different legal interpretations. And with this date, the deadline date coming next year, I'm just wondering. But what do you see as an end game in terms of what the outcomes could be, and maybe one or two biggest challenges that the OECD would really have to sit down and think about? Yeah,
the BEPS project was a success, and I think it was a greater success that many, certainly me, and I think probably some in the OECD thought it would be. We've seen the changes to international tax law that now make it much harder to, for example, use tax treaties artificially, to be able to suck profit out of a jurisdiction by over-leveraging businesses, so sort of interest deductions, and et cetera, We've seen more transparency, more country-by-country reporting. So I think they've been buoyed by the fact that was so successful into looking at changing things more fundamentally. We haven't really got onto the second part, because although there is this first part in terms of profit allocation, they're also looking at a kind of a global anti-base erosion rules, which would be shortened to GLOBE, which is to essentially prevent deductions from being given where payment is made from a high-tax jurisdiction to a low-tax jurisdiction. So, for example, if you had a payment being made from Nigeria to, let's say, the British Virgin Islands, where you get a tax deduction on the face of it in Nigeria, let's assume there's no withholding tax on that payment, so it comes out to the British Virgin Islands without there being any tax paid and no corresponding pickup in that jurisdiction, then there is a proposal to deny the deduction in Nigeria, which again should
because I knew that is already going on now, because there was a case between I think the Vodacom and FIRS where the FIRS took a withholding tax from and they went to court and the FIRS won.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing more of this. This will go further than the withholding tax. So there's and withholding tax does form part of this, as it probably must, because there is always a danger, notwithstanding better tax enforcement mechanisms across the world. Withholding tax isn't a bad way to get money, because it's imposed on the payer on account of the liability of the payee. So that makes some sense. So this is going further than that. But in a way, there then gets to questions of tax sovereignty. Nigeria doesn't tax capital gains on the sale of shares. Okay? Now, that is not common. That's slightly off market. I happen to think that if Nigeria did do that, that might not be a bad way to raise some revenues. Is it the right of the OECD or other government organisations to come to Nigeria and to say, you have to tax that? And so in part, and it does the report does hold off this, but in part you start to get to a position where, saying there has to be a minimum rate of tax in a particular jurisdiction. Ireland has a rate of 12.5%. Some countries don't have corporation tax at all. The UK is seeing a reduction in its corporation tax rate. That's generally where things are going. Is it for the OECD to say, in effect, that you will be disadvantaged if you don't have a certain level of corporation tax? Should Nigeria be required to tax sales of shares, gains on sales of shares? Should Nigeria be required to have a higher rate of VAT if it didn't want to? So it does start to get to these points where you ask the question about whether tax sovereignty will still exist. Yeah. I suspect it will, but there are certainly some challenges.
There's certainly more questions than answers at this point, Jeremy. We're going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much for sharing that perspective.
Thank you, Esther.
Giving us a good insight on this proposal. And of course, I cannot wait to see how it all turns out. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for being here today. Jeremy Cape, International Tax Partner at Squire Patton Boggs. That's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And of course, you can send tweets to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther Awoniyi. Thank you for watching and bye for now.